Hello and welcome. Has the Mexican president's military crackdown on organized crime actually strengthened the drug lords' resolve? The public seems to have lost faith in a government which has failed to stem the violence, and the cartels appear to be filling the political vacuum, even becoming Robin Hood-style figures. Around 23,000 people have died in drug-related battles in Mexico since President Felipe Calderón vowed to get rid of organized crime. Reports say 6,000 or so people have been killed in drug violence already this year, and of those, 183 murders were trademark beheadings. The deployment of 40,000 troops to fight the cartels has had little success, and many say the worst is yet to come. So today we ask, as political institutions reach their breaking point, are drug cartels looking more and more like a de facto government in Mexico? You can join our conversation with your questions and comments. Send an SMS or an email and we'll take your phone calls on the show. We're joined from New York by writer William Finnegan, who recently visited the Mexican state of Michoacan to find out more about the drug cartel La Familia and the pervasive power of drug traffickers in the country. From California, we have Miguel Tincarsalas, a professor of Latin American studies who received an award last year from the Mexican Journalist Association for his political analysis of the situation there. I welcome you both to the show, and William Finnegan, if I could start with you. Very few people in Mexico are speaking out about what's going on there regarding the drug cartels. What's the fear? What are the risks of people actually coming forward?
Well, there's considerable risk. I'd say less so in Mexico City, where you don't have any dominant cartel really intimidating people in the same way you do outside Mexico City. But in Michoacan, where I was working, people were pretty terrified for pretty good reason to even speak to me about what was going on.
Professor, want to welcome you to the show and ask about an assessment. We'll get an assessment from you, yes, sir, on the situation as far as the president's I guess lack of success with dealing with the drug cartels. He promised when he came into office 4 years ago he would launch a war against drugs. How do you rate what's happened in these past 4 years of his office?
Well, unfortunately, it has been really a disaster for the Mexican society and the Mexican population. As you pointed out, 23,000 Mexicans have been killed in this conflict. There has been a destabilization of civic society. Some areas are actually controlled by the narco traffickers. Some areas are in contention between narco traffickers. We see the impact on that on a very daily basis. Some areas of Mexico are militarized. It's like walking through a war zone. Other areas live in fear. We saw that fear expressed in the recent elections. The candidate in the state of Hidalgo, Xochitl Gálvez, claims that she was accosted by the Zetas, so that it has impacted almost every level of civic society, of social society in Mexico, and produced a very dramatic change in how Mexican society envisions itself and sees its relationship with the government.
Okay, William Finnegan, I've got a couple of emails I'd like to put back to you. These came from viewers talking about the issue of governance. The first one is from a viewer by the name of Nasser Abba Yusuf, who wrote in saying, drug lords can substitute politicians because they control their country's political institutions and wealth to a great extent. And the second one is from Bangladesh that says, until the government provides better economic conditions, this is going to continue. How can a government compete with drug money and drug lords? Now, I wonder, with public distrust of the police and the courts as well as the politicians continues to grow to the point of collapsing, I guess, what sort of role have the cartels taken on as a sort of institutional replacement, in the vacuum that's taken place? To what degree are they basically implementing their own law and order?
Well, in the area I was looking at, the western state of Michoacan, I'd have to say to a very great degree, there's a condition of what people call state capture. The group I was looking at is called La Familia Michoacana, relatively new cartel, has nonetheless managed in the places I was looking at, the communities, the cities I was looking at, to replace the governmental authorities. I mean, as you mentioned, the distrust of the police and the courts and the government generally has reached a point, due to corruption, due to lack of accountability, lack of resources, reached a point where an alternative structure that can provide employment, that can provide protection, that can build schools, clinics, I mean, all these social services that the government's not able to provide, becomes welcome. It's different in different areas. I looked at 2 different cities where the state of occupation was quite different, the balance of power, but it's a general condition, I'm afraid, of state capture.
Now, Professor, the state of Michoacan, which William Finnegan's referring to there, a report from about that state says that up to 85% of legitimate businesses now have some kind of dealings with the cartels, with La Familia. And I wonder to what degree the cartels have therefore gained some sort of legitimacy among the people there.
Well, in fact, they have gained legitimacy, as William points out. They, in fact, have provided social services. They have provided, understand that there are three main sources for those kind of benefits. One is the government, you would expect. The other is remittances from immigrants. And the third has increasingly become the narco-traffickers and the families themselves. And they are providing money for school, money for sports facilities, money for small loans. But they've also penetrated the economy. They charge racketeering. They charge protection. They control most of the piracy, so that they have created a foothold, and their money is also trickled into the actual campaign system, into the political process, so that in the last election they didn't so much want to disrupt the elections as they wanted their candidates to win, because they've reached a level of accommodation with some sectors of the Mexican political class that allows them to coexist and to essentially create, in some areas, an operating state or a state function.
William Finnegan, is that relationship, for example, La Familia has with the people, is it based on fear? What sort of tools do they use? I gather they have a sort of a Robin Hood kind of image as well, and perhaps even draw on religious fervor.
Well, fear is a huge part of it. Some people are clear about that and will speak about it. A lot of others won't. I mean, the fear is so pervasive that even talking about the fear is dangerous. The penetration of politics that Miguel was describing is a huge part of people's fear. There's really nowhere to turn, and the benefits of association with La Familia in Michoacan, the protection they can provide if you have some problem, is real, and the social services are real. Although in places where the Calderon campaign, the military campaign, has been very aggressive. Some of those clinics, drug rehab facilities and so on have actually had to shut down as La Familia has had to lie lower.
Now, I gather, though, Mr. Finnegan, that there are areas where the people have even asked the army to withdraw, that they have less faith in the army and the police services.
Yeah, it's almost hard to understand from outside, but in Ciudad Juarez, for instance, the border city with El Paso, Texas, that is the single bloodiest battlefield in this drug war in Mexico. There have been demonstrations, people asking, not against the cartels and the hitmen that are primarily responsible for this carnage, but asking the army to withdraw. There's a tremendous number of human rights abuses taking place in what's essentially a dirty war. At the same time, those kinds of demonstrations, which take place in Michoacan also, it's never very clear who's sponsoring them, why people are out there in Michoacan. It is clear that some demonstrations against the government, against the army, calling it an army of occupation, are actually sponsored by La Familia.
Professor, I gather that, well, it would surprise, I guess, a lot of people that La Familia took out paid advertising in two of the major state papers, asking the question, who are we? And then offering a fairly long answer, which included the suggestion that basically the people are being oppressed by the government, and that the cartel has been asked to come in and sort of take over, I guess. The language seemed to have an air of political resistance to it. I wonder to what degree there's an undercurrent of revolution running here.
I'm not quite sure there's an undercurrent revolution. There's an undercurrent of discontent in Mexican society, and the cartels are tapping into that. The situation with Michoacan and the Familia is not unique to that area. We saw in the case of the Cartel del Golfo, its leader taking out ads on Mother's Day, on Children's Day, sponsoring activities in the state Tamaulipas, giving away free bicycles, giving away free goods, in essence providing the kind of support that the Mexican state had previously supported. I think there's a very clear connection that the ability of the cartels to fill that political void, that social void, is in direct relationship to the state actually abandoning those regions. To the extent that beginning in the 1980s with Mexico, in fact, implementing this sort of a neoliberal approach towards politics and government, they have abandoned many of the social arena that they previously occupied. And to that extent, the cartels have begun to fill that void, whether it's social, whether it's sports, whether it's in terms of social programs, and have actually then replaced the state in those areas.
William Finnegan, there's a tendency for outsiders to compare various armed groups across Latin America and I guess to assign similarities. To what degree is there any real comparison between La Familia and other drug cartels and, say, Colombia's FARC guerrillas?
The situations in Mexico and Colombia are very often compared, sometimes hopefully in Mexico. That is to say, in Colombia 20 years ago, you had a kind of national security threat from then the two main cartels, Medellin and Cali, who were the largest cocaine operations in the world. And they were defeated over the course of the 90s. And while drug manufacturing and drug dealing and organized crime are still quite powerful in Colombia, you no longer have a threat to the security of the state. Mexicans are hoping that they are about to hit bottom and follow the Colombian model, as it were, and gain some traction against the cartels. But the situations are very, very different. You mentioned the FARC. There is, a leftist insurgency in league with drug trafficking organizations in Colombia. There's nothing comparable in Mexico. You have the character of an insurgency with some of and state replacement with some of the cartels, including La Familia and in the Gulf, but not the same conditions of long-term revolutionary violence that you had in right. Colombia, for instance.
Professor, let me ask for your take on that. Do you ever see the risk of Mexico's drug traffickers developing any kind of ideological slant to their actions?
Up to this point, I would say that with few exceptions, they have not. I mean, there are examples in Michoacan where there is some level of discontent. But on the larger question, they're playing on that discontent. But largely, this is a financial operation. This is an economic imperative. This is an economic orientation. I don't see them so far connecting to that. But again, as I said, they play on the discontent. They're able to utilize that. They're able to manipulate that. They're also, as I said, reached a level of accommodation with political forces and political classes that allow them to operate. And that's the only way we can explain the level of impunity with which they're able to operate is that they have at some level support from some in the population and also with those in the police force. And even some worry today that in the case of the military, that the military has also been corrupted or has been penetrated as well.
Well, we're going to take a very short break here, gentlemen. When we return, a look at how Mexico might deal with its institutional breakdown. We'll be right back. Don't go away. Welcome back. Support for Mexico's government is waning in the face of a growing drug war. Last Sunday, during local polls widely seen as a litmus test for next year's presidential elections, campaign offices were bombed, candidates were killed, and dead bodies were even hung from bridges. We're discussing the growing strength and influence of the drug cartels. With me is writer William Finnegan, who recently traveled to the Michoacan state, the president's home state, to investigate La Familia drug cartel, and Professor Miguel Tinker-Salas, a Latin American historian who has written extensively on the subject. An email to you, William Finnegan, if I may, from a viewer by the name of Amin Olasen, who wrote in saying, those people complaining and trying to stop drug trafficking are the same people who created the business.
I wonder if that means Americans, because certainly the American appetite for illegal drugs is what drives this whole business. And I mean, it drives Mexicans to despair that their country is being torn apart by this business essentially feeding this great addict to the north.
It's a question that a lot of people ask, actually, Mr. Finnegan. Is it America's war or is it Mexico's war?
Well, it's certainly the cartels we're talking about are multinational, vertically integrated enterprises at this point. They're in many things besides drugs. Drugs is maybe half the business of some of the bigger cartels. They're into many other arms smuggling and human smuggling and a long laundry list of illegal activities and legitimate businesses as well. And to successfully confront those kinds of organized crime networks, you obviously need a sort of multinational approach. The U.S. needs to be very heavily involved with Mexico and for that matter, other countries. I mean, the United Nations is currently working with the Guatemalan government, doing a kind of an experiment with outside special prosecutors, that is non-Guatemalans, coming in to pursue investigations and prosecutions of organized crime. And I think Mexico is reaching a point where it may need something like that too.
Professor, I want to get your take on a belief that many people have that the strength of the PRI party when it was in power created some kind of allegiance with the drug cartels to the extent that they were able to contain the violence, and that the fall of the PRI party in 2000 also led to the growth of the drug cartels and the strength of the drug cartels as the sort of political situation changed in Mexico. Now, there's a view that perhaps if the PRI party gained strength, which it seems to have a little bit, that those allegiances may be reformed, and again things may change and the drug cartels may be a little more controlled. What's your view on that idea?
I think the genie's out of the bottle. I think that's impossible to go back to that. Undoubtedly, the PRI had reached a level, or at least elements within the PRI. Again, I don't want to speak in terms of the national party, but at least within that state level, leadership had reached a level of accommodation with the narco traffickers. You had the Sinaloa cartel in Sinaloa, you had the Tijuana cartel in Tijuana, the Juarez cartel in Juarez, the Golfo in the Golfo. What happens in the post-PRI era is that those deals are renegotiated. There's a saying in Mexico, se vende la plaza. They sold the routes, they sold the control of the municipality. What happens as new political forces come in, they attempt to reach those levels of accommodation. Once again, they resell those routes, and that in essence then leads to confrontation between police forces and traffickers, among traffickers themselves, and the traffickers see an opportunity then to expand their operations and move out of their territories and begin to challenge each other in ways that they had not in the past. I think the genie's out of the bottle. No matter who wins the elections, I doubt that we'll see a return to that. The real challenge here is the pursuit of a single military policy as the only solution to this crisis.
I wonder, William Finnegan, with the administration of George W. Bush applauding the administration of Felipe Calderon coming in with a declaration against war, the Merida initiative was created, $1 billion plus effort to try to tackle the issue. Has that essentially failed? Does there need to be a new approach to how America liaises with Mexico to fight the drug cartels?
Well, I wouldn't say that it's essentially failed yet, no. I would say that the Obama administration has very much continued the Bush approach to Mexico, the applause you mentioned for Obama's, for Calderon's really militarized approach to the problem, and that's not working. The Merida initiative encompasses a lot of different kinds of aid, not primarily military aid, but lots of training and attempts to professionalize law enforcement, the judicial system, the prison system. All of these areas of public security in Mexico badly need reform, and the U.S. can contribute quite a bit there.
Professor, what impact has the current situation with the cartels and the violence and stress that society is facing had on the potential for economic recovery for Mexico, especially in this current tough climate?
Well, it really has impacted it. And the violence in many cases have shooed away visitors. Tourists don't go in the same numbers they have in the past. There's a greater fear of crossing the border into Mexico. There's fear of investment. But that, again, that's the generalized climate of violence that Mexico is under, in which, again, capital does not want to go into areas that are conflicted, and that face this ongoing crisis. And I think the larger issue is that the Calderon administration's single-minded focus only on a military solution has essentially run its course, and this administration seems unable or unwilling to consider other options.
Do you think, Professor, that the pressure will come from the public on the government of Felipe Calderon to change things economically, to tackle the economic side, irrespective of what's happening with the drug side?
I think that there are increasing voices within Mexico that this policy has failed. Popular opinion already says it has failed. The reality is this has a social component, an economic component, a cultural component, a judicial component, financial component, all of which this administration has failed to address. It has, again, single-mindedly focused only on a military option. And even the U.S. recognizes that option will not be victorious in Afghanistan, and it cannot be victorious in Mexico.
William Finnegan, on looking at alternatives, we had a viewer who wrote in an email using the handle Melodious Chronology from Texas in the USA, who wrote in saying, if people want to use drugs, they reap the benefits or pay the consequences. Their choice. let them make their own decisions and then tax it. Now, in the past, there have been Mexican diplomats who've said legalize drugs. That would crush the profits of the drug lords and destroy the power of the cartels. Is that even a viable consideration?
I don't think it's politically viable, no. I mean, marijuana is being sort of slowly legalized on both sides of the border, I think. Over time, that may come. But the cocaine, heroin, and methamphetamine, which is a major part of the problem at this point, are not going to be legalized. It's not, I mean, it's arguable, the question, you know, it's debatable, but it's politically not viable and not going to happen. And talking about strategies that might be used beyond the military strategy, which has stalled out and has obviously escalated the violence hugely in Mexico. The financial assets of the cartels, I would say, are probably the most vulnerable area for the organized crime groups, and that is a serious attack on organized crime where it's been successful, including in the U.S., Italy to some extent, Colombia to some extent. There's always been a focus on seizing assets, criminal asset forfeiture or civil asset forfeiture laws that begin to reclaim some of the economy from the organized crime groups, and that's not been happening in Mexico.
Professor, I have about 20 seconds, so just a line really. Do you remain optimistic that things can improve? Because from the outside, it looks like everything's going downhill.
I am not optimistic that things can improve. I think this administration has lost the opportunity to move the discussion forward. Calderon refuses to consider other options, and unfortunately the consequences will increase, and the Mexican population pays the price.
Well, gentlemen, I want to thank you very much for discussing this with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for being with us too. Remember, you can follow the show on Facebook, even become a fan of the Riz Khan Show, share your questions and comments, and talk to other viewers around the world. On the next show, Haiti marks 6 months since the devastating earthquake that killed nearly 300,000 people. The government has yet to secure shelter for the millions left homeless, and reconstruction still plagued by the massive amounts of rubble that engulfed the country. How long is the road to recovery? Make sure you tune in for that. From me and the team, we'll see you next time.